It was supposed to be a quiet ride home. Claire Reese walked down the jet bridge with her ID badge turned backwards and her eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Not because she was famous, far from it. She just didn't like being noticed. Mechanics weren't supposed to be seen, especially not the ones who used to wear a patch that said Combat Recovery Unit. She wasn't part of the flight crew. She wasn't on vacation either. Just a tech inspector catching a ride after completing 3 weeks of hangar audits in Nevada. One of those silent contracts where you wore a polo instead of a uniform and signed reports with a pen that never left a trace. Gate agents had put her in the very back of the aircraft, near the galley, row 32. No window, no legroom, but she didn't complain. Her boots were still dusty, her olive jacket folded tight over her lap. A small tablet sat in her bag, its screen filled with maintenance logs and schematic overlays. She glanced around the cabin. Typical mix, a few families, mostly solo business travelers. Overhead bins were closing, engines humming in the background, almost ready. Then came the crew. A younger captain, maybe late 30s, confident, chatty, a little too relaxed. The co-pilot, even younger, first officer from the look of his posture, still green, the type who trusted instruments over instincts. Claire watched them board without reacting. She'd seen that type before. Fly-by-wire loyalty, not enough hours in older systems. The cabin attendants were efficient but distracted. One of them, a tall woman with tightly braided hair, caught Claire's eye for a moment. A flicker of familiarity passed between them. Nothing said, but something noted. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 806 to Denver. Estimated flight time, 2 hours, 23 minutes. Claire closed her eyes. The plane taxied. Takeoff was smooth. Cabin pressure adjusted properly. Engine tones were clean. She didn't need gauges to know the plane was behaving. She could feel it. 35,000 feet, cruising altitude. Beverage service began. Passengers relaxed into their movies and snacks. Claire pulled out her tablet, pretending to scroll, but her mind drifted, not forward, but back. Back to a tent in the desert. Back to the hum of rotor blades. Back to the broken bones of F-18s landing half dead after combat. Back to the smell of scorched muddle and hydraulic fluid. She had rebuilt wings that should never have flown again. She had crawled inside machines still warm from fire. But that was years ago. Now she wrote silent reports for civilian fleets. Now she flew coach in silence, waiting for touchdown like everyone else. Until something changed. A tremor in the floor. Subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Claire's eyes opened instantly. Then a shudder. Not turbulence, a system misfire. She'd felt it before. Passengers didn't react. But Claire unbuckled her belt, just slightly. The captain's voice came on, scratchy, uneven. Folks, we're experiencing a minor issue with one of the indicators. Nothing serious, but we're checking it out. Please stay in your seats. Claire frowned. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Too much breath, hesitation. He was either distracted or disoriented. She looked up. The flight attendants had paused mid-service, whispering now. One of them grabbed the intercom phone and tried the cockpit. No response. Another tremor, this time a lurch in the left wing. Claire stood, not rushed, not panicked, deliberate. The attendant blocked her path. "Ma'am, I need you to remain seated." Claire spoke calmly, clearly. "You've got a dead channel from the cockpit, a pressure fault in the left actuator, and your primary pilot just slurred over the intercom. You need me to walk up there. Now." The attendant froze. "How do you—" Claire reached into her jacket and pulled out the folded badge. Not her airport ID, the one with the eagle, the one that didn't expire. Move. The aisle cleared, and as she walked toward the cockpit door,
Turbulence shook the cabin again. The alarms hadn't started yet, but they would, because at 38,000 feet, something had already gone wrong. And this time, no one else was coming to fix it. The cabin grew quieter with each step Claire took toward the front. Passengers turned their heads as she passed, their faces etched with the vague tension of people who didn't yet know why they were nervous. The plane still flew steady, but something in the air had shifted, like the breath before a storm. Claire reached the cockpit door. No answer to the intercom call. The flight attendant she'd spoken to earlier followed, her face pale now, lips pressed tight. I knocked twice, nothing. Claire nodded once. She placed her palm flat on the panel beside the door, where a discreet override switch would be. Not standard for passengers, but Claire knew the manufacturer. She knew this model like she knew her own bones. The emergency access code wasn't public, but she'd seen too many dead pilots to care about red tape. She entered the sequence. A dull click. The door eased open. She stepped inside and stopped cold. The cockpit reeked of sweat and burnt coffee. The air was thick. Warning lights blinked red across the console, not screaming, not yet, but building like a breath held too long. The co-pilot was slumped sideways in his seat, headset half off, eyes closed, shallow breathing. Still alive. The captain sat rigid, one hand gripping the yoke, the other pressed to his chest. His mouth was moving, barely, as if trying to speak but choking on the effort. Claire dropped her bag and stepped in without asking permission. "Sir? Captain?" He turned, eyes glassy, and whispered something only she could hear. "Valkyrie." Her pulse skipped.
It had been years since anyone had said that name out loud. That wasn't just a word. It was a clearance level. It was a buried chapter. She moved fast, checked the co-pilot's vitals. Still conscious, but likely oxygen-deprived. Cabin pressure was fine, but something had failed in the environmental subsystem up front. It was isolated. Intentional? Malfunction? It didn't matter. He was out. She slipped into the right seat. The yoke was trembling. Trim instability. Claire's fingers moved on instinct, adjusting for pitch manually. "Captain, can you release control?" His hand gripped tighter. "Sir, I need the controls." His fingers loosened slowly. Whether in consent or collapse, she couldn't tell. His eyes were already fading, and the name he'd whispered lingered like smoke in the air. Claire's hands wrapped around the yoke. The world outside the cockpit was clouds and blue silence, but the control panel told a different story. Stability assist, down. Navigation drift, increasing. Hydraulic redundancy, offline. Engine 2, unstable burn. She exhaled through her nose. This bird wasn't falling, yet, but it was on the edge. She reached for the headset, slipped it on, scanned frequencies. The auto-comm system had defaulted to local tower chatter, useless. She switched manually, trying to establish a link to any ATC node. Static. No signal confirmation. Then she saw it. The main antenna switch had been disabled. Whether it was a power surge or deliberate sabotage, she couldn't tell yet. But this plane was cut off, isolated in the sky. Behind her, the attendant whispered from the door. Do you know how to fly?" Claire didn't turn around. She simply said, "Enough to land us." It wasn't a boast. It was a promise. Because Valkyrie wasn't just a code name. It was a command title from a unit that no longer existed. A unit trained not to fight wars, but to bring broken machines and broken people down from the sky when everyone else had already given up. She didn't need clearance. She didn't need permission. She just needed altitude. And a runway that still believed in miracles. She keyed into the emergency transponder manually, firing off a short burst beacon. If any tower was listening, they'd know this flight was in trouble. The systems were fighting her, but the airframe itself was intact. For now. Claire scanned the horizon.
and somewhere below the clouds, she knew the ground was waiting. Claire adjusted the manual trim, one notch at a time, feeling the aircraft respond with sluggish resistance, like steering through molasses. The plane was fighting her, not in a mechanical sense, but through years of over-automation and pilots who had forgotten how to feel their aircraft through the controls. Claire hadn't. She had once trained on warbirds stripped down to their bones. No assist, no autopilot, just gravity, instinct, and math you didn't have time to write down.
Her fingers danced over the analog toggles, overriding system protections that would have taken most pilots 5 minutes and a manual. But Claire didn't need reminders. The procedures were still burned into her hands, into her breath, into the rhythm of her pulse. In the left seat, the captain had slumped fully now, unconscious but breathing. She stabilized his seat angle, secured his belt, and dimmed the primary displays to reduce heat load on the failing avionics. The cabin crew still hadn't denounced anything. Good. Let them keep the passengers calm a little longer. Let them believe the silence was normal. Claire's voice came calm and clipped through the intercom. "Cockpit has received your message. Additional support has been activated. Remain seated with belts fastened." That was all they needed to hear. Not a lie, just not the full story. She wasn't just additional support. She was now the flight commander, and this was no longer a commercial route. It was an operation. 15 years ago, Claire had stood in a bunker classroom with 7 others. Their names didn't matter. Their files were redacted before they even started. They weren't pilots yet. They were contingencies. The Valkyrie protocol was born out of fear. What if pilots were lost mid-air? What if recovery became impossible? What if there was no time to divert to another base, no chance for ground intervention? So they trained them, a secret corps, pilots who could fix, fight, fly, and disappear. Claire had been the top of her class, but when the program was quietly shut down after a classified incident overseas, the graduates were given 2 options: go private or vanish. Claire had chosen neither. She just disappeared, moved into civilian contracts, worked hangars, filed reports, became invisible. Until now, until one overheated cockpit at 38,000 feet called her name again. She accessed the backup nav module. The plane had drifted 7 nautical miles off course, not dangerous yet, but with engine 2 bleeding performance and the primary nav antenna disabled, they'd lose routing entirely within 20 minutes. She needed a heading. She needed land. She toggled the satellite terrain overlay, offline. But Claire didn't panic. She dug into the systems manually, found a local echo map, barely usable but enough to get a sense of geography. Then she cross-referenced the current altitude, descent rate, wind vector, and fuel status. All in her head. No apps, no assistance. A cluster of rough peaks sat 50 miles out, unlandable. But 20 miles ahead, a flat patch. No beacon, not an airport. Maybe an abandoned strip. Maybe nothing. But maybe enough. She took a deep breath and keyed in a heading. Adjusted flaps for smoother descent. Reset the circuit breaker on the dead comm line. Once. Twice. Static. Still nothing.
If they were going to land, they'd do it without tower clearance. A door hissed open behind her. One of the younger flight attendants, maybe early 20s, entered, eyes wide. "Ma'am, sorry, do you need anything?" Claire looked at her, truly looked. The girl was shaking, trying not to. "What's your name?" Jennifer, I mean." Claire nodded. "Jen, I'm Claire. This flight's going to need 2 things: calm in the cabin and muscle up front." Jen blinked. "Muscle?" Claire smiled faintly. "To pull the landing gear manually. This model system is fried." The girl just nodded, breath shaky. Claire recognized the fear, not the kind that makes you freeze, the kind that makes you show up anyway. Claire opened a small side panel near the base of the cockpit floor, emergency crank. She hadn't touched one since Kandahar.
Jen, when I say now, you're going to turn this with everything you've got. Don't stop until I say. The girl swallowed. Okay. Claire took her seat again. Adjusted pitch. The horizon line tilted slightly. She whispered to herself, not to Jen, not to the plane, but maybe to the sky. You buried me once. Let's see what's left. Outside, clouds broke, and far below, that flat patch gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. She didn't know if it was long enough, didn't know if the gear would hold, didn't know if the wings would stay intact. But she knew one thing. They weren't going to fall out of the sky, not on her watch. The cockpit was quiet, but not because everything was fine. It was the kind of silence that came when warning systems had failed or had been silenced. The artificial horizon flickered, struggling to hold its place. The co-pilot was unconscious. The captain was breathing, but out cold. And the controls, every last one of them, now belonged to Claire. She adjusted her grip on the yoke, her shoulders tense, but steady. The plane was dropping faster than she liked. Flaps weren't responding fully, and the hydraulic system was showing signs of failure. The landing gear system was offline. Everything that should have helped was either dead or dying. Behind her, Jen stood near the manual crank panel, still holding her breath like someone expecting an explosion. She didn't look ready, but she hadn't left either. Breathe. Claire said, her tone calm, measured. You won't turn anything until I say. We'll time it by altitude. Stay alert. Jen gave a nervous nod, fingers twitching over the crank. She was scared, but she was present. That was more than enough. Claire scanned ahead. The flat patch she'd spotted was real, but barely. An old military service strip, faded to near invisibility. Its surface was cracked, faded, possibly unstable. Pine trees pressed in from both sides like closing jaws. It was far from ideal, but it was the only chance they had. She manually dialed in a new descent path, calculating approach angles without relying on software or support.
This wasn't about procedure now. This was about feel, intuition honed through war zone simulations and years of silent repetition. She leaned on the rudder, corrected left yaw, trimmed the pitch, and throttled down the second engine just enough to hold stability. Then she spoke again, her voice firm over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your acting pilot. We are making an emergency descent. Please remain seated, keep your seatbelts fastened, and follow all crew instructions. In the cabin, quiet spread like fog. The sound of anxious breathing, whispered prayers, and the rustle of tightened belts took over. Some passengers stared forward, frozen. Others squeezed hands or closed their eyes. No one screamed. Not yet. Claire watched the altimeter tick down. 9,000 feet, 8,600, 8,100. Jen, she said without turning, get ready. Jen knelt at the manual crank, pale and shaking. When I say go, turn it steadily. Don't stop until I say. Jen nodded, both hands gripping the crank like a lifeline. 7,400 feet, 6,900. Claire kept one hand on the yoke and one eye on the emergency gear status indicators. Now! Jen turned the crank with everything she had, her arms strained, muscles trembling, but she didn't stop. Claire watched the lights. First, nothing. Then, clunk. One gear light turned green. Another clunk, second one. Keep going. A deep metallic grind echoed beneath them. Then silence. 3 green lights. Claire allowed herself one slow exhale. Stop. Jen collapsed backward, panting but conscious. Claire adjusted pitch again, eyes locked on the terrain. The old strip was less than 5 miles out now. No lights, no tower, no instruments, just faded asphalt and blind faith. Altitude, 3,000 feet. She throttled back further. The remaining engine coughed.
Claire whispered under her breath, more to the aircraft than to herself. Just hold a little longer. She flipped the breaker on the warning alarms. The cockpit went quiet. No more stall alerts, no more terrain warnings, no more distractions. Outside, the wind howled against the fuselage as the plane began final approach. Claire's mind moved faster than her hands, calculating wind drift, sink rate, angle of attack. There was no margin, no backup. Altitude, 1,200 feet. Airspeed, unstable but controllable. The cracked concrete grew larger in the front window. She could see the tree line on both sides now. Too close, too sharp. This wasn't a runway. It was a broken promise. Altitude, 800 feet. The aircraft trembled. One last gust hit the wing. She corrected instinctively, barely flinching. Her hands moved with the kind of certainty that didn't come from training, but from memory. Raw, unfiltered, unshakable. Altitude, 300 feet. She lowered the nose slightly. Airspeed dipped, then held. Throttled back. Pull. Touch. The front gear slammed into the concrete, jarring every bone in her body.
Seconds later, the rear wheels hit with a deafening crash. Sparks flew from the undercarriage. The tires screeched in protest. She held the yoke steady as the plane began to veer slightly. She corrected, braking hard, her entire body leaning into the controls. Trees on both sides, runway rapidly disappearing. The aircraft skidded, jolted, and then stopped. Not gracefully, not quietly, but completely. For a moment, no one in the cockpit moved. Not a breath, not a sound. Then behind her, Jen exhaled in a half-sob. Claire slowly unclenched her fists from the yoke. Her knuckles were bloodless white. They had landed, and no one had died. She stood, opened the cockpit door, and faced the cabin full of wide, terrified eyes. No one spoke, but the silence had changed. It was no longer fear. It was disbelief and awe. Claire nodded once, said nothing, and stepped into the aisle. She wasn't supposed to fly this plane, but she had, and they were still alive because of it. The first thing Claire noticed was the smell. Burned rubber, hot metal, something acrid from the undercarriage system still venting heat as the fuselage sat motionless on the fractured tarmac. Outside the shattered window of the cockpit, the trees loomed, tall, jagged, almost too close. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals from beneath the wings, but there was no fire, not yet, and no explosion. That alone felt like a miracle. Inside the cabin, the silence fractured all at once. A baby cried. Someone sobbed. A man let out a loud, relieved laugh that turned into a wheeze. And then came the sound Claire hadn't been expecting. Applause. It started from the rear, hesitant and slow, as if no one was sure whether it was real, whether they had actually survived. But once the first few claps broke through the stunned air, the wave surged forward. People were clapping, shouting, calling out through tears. The cabin filled with the kind of noise that only the living ever make. Claire didn't smile. Not yet. Her heart was still catching up with the reality that they were on the ground. She turned back to Jen. "You okay?" Jen wiped her face, still crouched against the bulkhead. "I think so. I don't know how you just did that." Claire gave a nod. "Me neither. But we're here." She stepped out into the main cabin fully now, her shoes crunching slightly over debris in the aisle. A passenger reached out and touched her arm. Another clasped her hand with trembling fingers. A woman mouthed the word "thank you" as her teenage daughter cried beside her. Claire didn't stop for hugs, didn't give a speech. She just kept moving. "Emergency slides will deploy soon," she called back toward the crew. "Check the wing status before you open those doors. We don't want anyone walking into fuel vapor or metal shards." One of the flight attendants, an older man with red-rimmed eyes, nodded quickly and began moving his team into action.
Claire knew the chaos that was about to unfold. Evacuation, triage, emergency responders, media, flashing lights, questions she didn't want to answer. What she didn't expect was the captain. He had regained consciousness. 2 paramedics had made it to the cockpit, and were attempting to stabilize him, but he waved them off, eyes locked on Claire as she moved down the cabin. His voice was hoarse, barely audible above the noise. Phoenix. The words struck her like a slap. She stopped in her tracks. Passengers murmured around her. Some noticed, some didn't. But the captain, he was looking directly at her now. And he had remembered. Not just the flight, not just the landing. Her code name. Claire didn't reply. She just gave a quiet nod, like the ghost of an old salute. That part of her, that name, was from a life she thought she had burned to ashes. But here it was again, spoken aloud in the wreckage of survival. And somehow, it fit. Outside, emergency vehicles were speeding across the makeshift airstrip. Lights blazed, radios crackled. Fire crews swept the fuselage, checking for leaks or sparks. Airport security, if you could call the two dusty uniforms security, were already forming a perimeter. Claire reached the front exit just as the slide deployed with a loud hiss and thud. She turned back to the passengers. "You'll be fine," she said simply. "Follow the crew. Don't run. Help each other." Someone asked, "Who are you?" Claire hesitated. Then, "Someone who used to fly." And with that, she stepped through the hatch and onto the slide. The moment her shoes hit the ground, applause rose again, this time from outside. Firefighters, paramedics, even the small group of airport workers and early responders. They had seen the impossible, a commercial jet landing safely on a decommissioned strip, guided in manually by a civilian woman in a crew vest and jeans. Claire barely acknowledged it. She moved to the side, checking her watch, checking the engine heat by habit. Her hands were still shaking, her eyes stung, but her voice was calm when the lead paramedic approached. "Any injuries?" "Co-pilot still unconscious, but stable. Captain's awake, needs medical evaluation. Minor head injury." "You?" "I'm fine. Name?" She paused. It would have been easy to say nothing, walk away, let the crew take the credit, let the chaos bury the truth. But something in her had shifted. Something that had stayed buried for too long was now awake again. "Claire," she said quietly. "Claire Dalton." He nodded, scribbled it down. And just like that, the legend began. Behind her, passengers slid to safety. One woman collapsed into the arms of her partner. A teenage boy hugged a firefighter. Children cried, clutching oxygen masks they no longer needed. Claire watched them all. She had flown them through fire, through failure, through the exact kind of pressure she was once told she couldn't handle. And they were alive. No headlines yet, no cameras, just a cracked runway and the raw aftermath of a landing that should have never been possible. But Claire had never needed fanfare. She just needed sky. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the plane was still parked exactly where it had come to rest, like a monument to everything that should have gone wrong but didn't. Fire crews had extinguished the last wisps of engine smoke. Paramedics had loaded the captain onto a stretcher, the co-pilot right behind him. The crew was being interviewed, cataloged, debriefed. Passengers sat wrapped in thermal blankets, sipping bottled water with trembling hands. And Claire? She sat on the edge of a rusted baggage cart just beyond the floodlights, alone, elbows on her knees, hands still stained with hydraulic fluid. No one had officially asked her for a statement yet. Not the FAA, not the press, not even the airline. But they were coming. She could see them gathering beyond the emergency barrier. Reporters, officials, men in suits with tight expressions, and phone cameras already rolling. A flight attendant approached quietly,
the older man who had watched her earlier with wide eyes. "They're asking for the pilot," he said gently. "Not the captain. You." Claire didn't respond. "They want to know who you are." She let out a slow breath. "Tell them I'm no one special," she said. "Just someone who didn't want to die today." He gave her a faint smile. "You'll need to do better than that. They've already seen the footage." Her head lifted slightly. "What footage?" He held out a phone. The screen showed a shaky vertical video taken from one of the middle rows during landing. It caught her voice over the intercom, her silhouette in the cockpit window, the impossible descent, the final bounce on the cracked tarmac. Already the post had over 1 million views. Comments flooded the screen. That was a woman? She saved all of them? Give her a medal. Give her a cockpit. I'd fly with her over any airline captain on Earth. Claire handed it back. "Delete it if you can. I think it's a little late for that." Soon after, a black SUV arrived. No markings, government plates. The door opened, and a woman in a tailored suit stepped out. FAA by the posture, maybe intelligence by the shoes. She approached slowly, clipboard in hand. "Claire Dalton?" "Yes." "I've been authorized to debrief you on site, but off record first. I wanted to shake your hand." Claire stood, more out of politeness than pride. The woman extended hers. "You flew a commercial aircraft without full systems, no clearance, into an abandoned Cold War strip with 0 fatalities. We've never seen anything like it." Claire looked past her, toward the dark silhouette of the aircraft. It still steamed faintly in the twilight.
"I didn't do it for headlines." "I know," the woman said. "That's why they'll want to make you one." Claire didn't answer. The debrief was short, precise. She listed the system failures, the manual gear crank, the decision to divert, the terrain judgment call. No embellishment, no drama, just facts. When the woman closed her clipboard, she paused. "There's going to be noise," she said. "Your name will be everywhere within 24 hours. I'll be gone by then. Where will you go?" Claire looked up at the stars now peeking through the darkening sky. Back to work, back to life, maybe to a flight school that still takes old names. "You'll have offers." "I'm not interested in offers." She turned and began to walk away. Reporters shouted her name, microphones thrust toward her face, questions fired like machine guns. "Claire, were you really a civilian? Is it true you trained with special ops? Are the rumors about your Air Force record real? Did they call you Phoenix?" She didn't stop. She didn't wave. She just walked past them, silent, composed, untouchable. Later that week, footage of her landing was played across every major news outlet. Analysts debated her training. Psychologists broke down her composure under pressure. Pilots from around the world posted reaction videos in stunned admiration. But Claire said nothing. She refused all interviews, declined every contract, ignored every Hollywood producer camped outside her apartment, until one envelope arrived, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a single note, penned in careful block letters. "My daughter watched you land that plane. She said she didn't know girls could fly like that. Now she wants to learn. Thank you for giving her a sky to believe in." That was the only message Claire ever responded to. She made one call. She didn't ask for money, attention, or anything in return. She just arranged the first scholarship, and then another, and another. Within a month, the Dalton Flight Initiative was born. Quietly, without press. No logos, no slogans. Just one purpose: to give flight
to those who had been told they never would. Claire began visiting hangars again, not as a guest, but as a mentor. She walked among simulators with sleeves rolled up and coffee in hand, taught breathwork during stall recovery, sat beside teenagers learning to taxi for the first time, and always, when someone asked if she was the Claire Dalton, she'd smile faintly and reply, "Only on one flight." The rest of the time, she was just a name on a roster, a quiet presence in the corner of a training bay, a woman who had once landed a plane no one else could, and then walked away without needing anyone to applaud. Because some heroes don't need medals. They just need a sky worth returning to.